Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. Thanks for joining us for the first episode of 2023, and I'm delighted to say for this episode we are joined by Eleanor Parker, she teaches Old and Middle English literature at Brasenose College, Oxford, as well as being a columnist for History Today and many other publications. She's known online, especially on Twitter, for her blog, The Clerk of Oxford, and her recently published book, Winters in the World, A Journey Through the Anglo-Saxon Year, has been highly acclaimed, and I've seen it featured on many Best Books of the Year lists recently. So it's wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I am thrilled to be able to have you on, especially for this first episode. Our listeners know we start the year a little bit late with Risking Enchantment. We begin in February, which is it's fitting given that we're probably going to talk about the different sorts of calendars and all of the different beginnings and ways of measuring time. But I still think it's a wonderful time of year to dive into this book. I mean, it works for any time. It's called Winters in the World. I read it in winter. It's great to start with winter, but it's also great to start at the start of the year, beginning of spring, and take the year as a whole and look at how we can kind of interact with the year with this particular perspective that you brought, which I just thought was wonderful. So maybe would you like to tell us a little bit about the book and the kind of era that it's talking about and what it's doing?
Yeah, so essentially the structure of the book, I mean, as you said, the subtitle is A Journey Through the Anglo-Saxon Year. So it takes the year, month by month or season by season, starting in the winter, because winter is the season that's written about most in Anglo-Saxon poetry, as I'm sure we'll talk about, and then going on through spring and summer and autumn, and kind of trying to link or trying to get a sense of what the Anglo-Saxon kind of experience of those kind of seasons could have been, how different people responded to those seasons, felt them, how they were connected to things like religious festivals. Yeah, so in terms of like where this fits in historically, when we talk about the Anglo-Saxon period, we're thinking about, from the 5th century up to the 11th century. So it's quite a long period of time in itself, actually. And one of the things that I was kind of thinking about in the book is, in a sense, there's not really one thing called the Anglo-Saxon year. It's, that's like hundreds of years that were experienced by many, many people. And they probably all would have had their own experience of that passage of the seasons. So we can get a glimpse into the ways different kinds of people would have experienced the year and felt about the seasons over that quite long period of English history.
Yeah, and I loved it. And I loved how you interwove a lot of the Anglo-Saxon poetry. As we were just talking before, I also studied Anglo-Saxon literature and history at university. It was just my favorite thing to do ever. And we have actually referenced you and your blog and your work on the podcast before. Speaking of the passage of time, I think it's coming up on 3 years, which is crazy. But we did an episode on Anglo-Saxon poetry for the Easter Triduum and the Easter season in general. And I think I reached out to you then to let you know we were using your great translations of some of those poems and some of your work on your blog. And so it's really fun to see it kind of laid out in a full year's worth of kind of insight into the ways that, like you said, it's quite a long period of time. I feel like when I say I study the Anglo-Saxons, they think Old England and they think maybe Shakespeare, and you try and say, try several hundred years, if not 1,000 years before that. This is quite a long way away. And I think it's easy when we're looking to the past to see, say, 300, 500 years as a small amount of time. Do we really think of 300 AD as that different to 800 AD? But if you were talking about it as a much closer timescale, we would see the huge difference between the 1800s and now, or any of those kinds of disparities. So I think it is really important to highlight that this is a very different kind of society throughout even its own beginning and middle and end, but that it was this great medieval time, and it came in a lot of different formats and had a lot of different traditions in it. But that as everyone who knows me knows, I really bristle at the kind of Dark Ages mentality, the kind of dismissal of the era. And I think it really comes through at how rich the cultural society was and how much they have to offer us now. And the ways that they were a society and celebrated things together is just really fascinating, and I think something that is actually really needed today. One of the things I really love is the way that you highlighted some of the festivals and feast days, and especially the religious feast days that have kind of fallen out of our calendar to an extent. I remember, I think it was again near the start of lockdown, you had a really great article in Unheard, which was about the sad loss of our common rituals, which at the time was about how we couldn't come together at all because we were all separated through lockdowns, but that in a much broader sense, we've lost a lot of the ways that we come together as a society and as a community, and how looking to the past and looking to these historical traditions is actually something that might be informative and inspirational for us now.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in that article I was talking about Whitsun, for instance, and this very long history of the Feast of Whitsun, you know, that's the English name for Pentecost, which obviously has its roots in one kind of culture, in a Christian festival, but then over the centuries adapted to be whatever people wanted it to be in terms of, sort of common festivity. You know, it was an occasion, it was in the summer, and it was a good time to get together and celebrate. So almost it was an excuse for doing all kinds of things that people just wanted to do together to enjoy good weather and, you know, a time of year that's a good time for a holiday. So I think, you know, the thing about these festivals is they aren't static. They evolve over time, and they can become what societies need them to be, and they can change and adapt. And I think there are certainly ways in which, even though these medieval festivals are in some ways, you know, really, really far away from us, and it's a society that has little in common with ours in lots of ways, we can adapt some of these festivals for our own purposes too, or we can have our own versions of them. There's no sense in which you need to just like either only mourn the loss of them and say, oh no, it was so wonderful when they existed, but well, we don't have that anymore, never mind. There's opportunity to rediscover them, to recreate them, to make them what we want them to be, because they aren't set in stone. Even in the medieval period, they were evolving and changing and developing over time. And you know, what they've become today, or what they could become today, is like the latest stage in that development.
Yeah, and I think I was struck with that. You also, in a similar time of year to Whitsun, mentioned in the book Rogation Tide, is it? Which is, you know, a season after Easter, but of a certain level of penitence, and it was a tradition of going on these processions and walks for penance, but it was a communal and a lighthearted and not an overly solemn affair. And I think you were mentioning how over time that did change with the Reformation, because it had been something with a lot of saints' relics and a lot of, you know, more Catholic trappings. And obviously that changed after the Reformation, but that it still existed in a different form with the marking of the parish bounds and having these communal times of communities to come together on, you know, in good weather and come together for these things that unite us all, such as, like, anyone who lives in Ireland or England, we all talk about the weather. So good weather is something that we do celebrate together. It is something worth celebrating, even as we've moved away from a more kind of agrarian and agricultural society, that it still matters to us when the sun comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still nice to have an opportunity to get together. You know, the thing about Rogation Tide and Whitsun, it's not just a time to get together with your own friends and your family and the people you see all the time. It's a time to see your neighbours and your wider community, and have a sense of, you know, who we are as a parish or a town or a city or whatever. And those kinds of other forms of belonging and other kinds of community, you know, it's often hard to find space for those, I think, in our society. But that's something that's clearly made Rogation Tide very popular and did allow it to survive in all these different forms, even though you would think this was like the classic example of a festival that would be suppressed at the Reformation, because, you know, processions and penance and saints' relics, like you say, you know, was all kind of Catholic and superstitious, and from a Reformation point of view. But that sense of a parish identity was something that was valuable. People still wanted this opportunity to, well, what they did would like mark the boundaries of their parish, and, you know, acknowledge that themselves as a community and have some sense of a sort of shared experience in that way. So I think these festivals can appeal to lots of different aspects of our social relationships, you know, the most personal ones, but also in a broader sense, you know, kind of broader community relationships too.
Yeah, I often think back, my brother used to work for quite a large company, and towards the end of his time there, they came up with this great idea, which was that you would actually be free to take your bank holiday days on other days. Like, just, it would be more like a number that you could use whenever you wanted. And I'm sure on first glance, like a lot of people, I do a lot of traveling myself, you do look at that and say, oh, that means I could go traveling more, I could go and spend the time the way that I want to. If the Maybank holiday means nothing to me, then I can go spend that day whenever I want. But I do actually think it's funny how that does dislocate us from doing things communally. That that as much as it is annoying, because if you're trying to do something on a bank holiday and you think, well, everyone's off, the beaches are going to be full, the power parks are going to be a nightmare. But there is something that I think is intrinsic to the way that we are supposed to live in communion with each other in a variety of ways, like we mentioned, like whether that's parishes or just neighbors or anything, that if we strip away these common feast days, even when they're just purely secular bank holidays, that there is a kind of loss of a sense of community. And as I would say from my own experience of many workplaces, it often means that you just don't get those days. That like it's almost like telling everyone that they have to be off guarantees that everyone is off because there's an expectation that you will take some time off. Whereas allowing yourself to just pick them in an individualistic way often just means that the work keeps getting put on your plate and you have to push off your plans and you don't know when to take your time. And it becomes this like agony of choice of, well, when is the best time to take this time? That actually having these rhythms of the year, it makes sense. Like it's the reason from a Christian point of view, we have a liturgical year, that we have this rhythm of the year that helps us not only find the rest that we need, but also to engage with the people around us, because otherwise everyone is on their own little individual disc that they're not actually touching anybody else's time off, and they're not kind of overlapping in any way, that there's not one big time for everyone to celebrate.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things I was also talking about in that Whitson article was the idea of the Sabbath, this sense that you actually need a rest, that we are not meant to work 7 days a week. We are not productivity machines. We need time off. And it's absolutely the case, like you say, that when that becomes optional, it becomes so easy for people to feel pressure to work all the time. Academics are terrible at this. They send their emails on like Christmas Eve and they expect a response. And, that's not healthy. That isn't particularly, conducive to a healthy state of mind or healthy attitude to work if you feel like there's no time that belongs to you and your interests and your hobbies and your time for rest for yourself. The pressure to work and to work constantly is always pushing against, I think, that our need for rest and Sabbath and what that can give us individually and communally. So I think it's kind of worth like fighting for these holidays, these festivals, because we need them. People value them. They still have something to offer. There's not just like a nice add-on to life, but actually something which contributes to making a more healthy, a more overall kind of peaceful and productive in a good sense kind of approach to life, which is not just about what you're producing, but doing so in a most effective way, I guess.
Yeah, and I've been really thrilled, even in very small ways, to see some businesses or places reclaiming a Sabbath mentality and saying we're not going to open, or even I did even see a couple of places not opening on Boxing Day or Stephen's Day this year for Christmas, that like actually clawing back some of this time, because as you said, there's such a need for that rest. And I think there's a multiplicity of ways that we can have celebrations as a community. And like from my perspective, it's great to have religious ones, but I think there are also other ways to have a kind of pluralist society that has space for different kinds of coming together. But that we have to almost reclaim it from the commercialism, because that's just another form of productivity. That's just more putting money into the economy. And also on the flip side, once you have a sort of commercialist view of it, then there has to be people to serve you in the shops. There has to be people to run the shops from the other end, to even online, to send out the packages, to do all of the kind of manual labor behind it. And so the more that things are based around just shopping or even going to specific events together, that there is a sense that somewhere along the line someone is missing out on this opportunity for leisure. And I think we're kind of it's a little while now, but we're coming out of Christmas, and I think you would probably agree with me that there's a real strain between, if you do really value this kind of liturgical year, between engaging in the Christmas that happens before Christmas now and the Christmas that should happen after Christmas in Christmas time and Epiphany time, rather than in this sort of strange Advent. And I was really struck this year by talking to a few people how far away we've moved from understanding this year. I knew someone who said to me that they thought Advent was the 12 days of Christmas, that there was some 12 days before Christmas that was technically Advent. And you kind of think, no.
Yeah, I've been really noticing that. I think that's a feature of just the past couple of years. And I think it's exactly what you're saying about commercialization, because apparently, it offers a sort of a commercial opportunity to sell like a 12 days of Christmas, like a mini advent calendar some companies sell, or social media companies make, this is our 12 days of Christmas thing, but they do it in the run up to Christmas because that's when they want the most engagement. So they're completely kind of shifting it to before Christmas because it serves their commercial purpose. There are forms of adaptation that are a little bit more troubling, I think.
Yeah, and that it is so important. I love, and I've mentioned it a bunch of times, there's that quote that I always come back to from the Screwtape Letters where they're talking about how God has made by that union of change and permanence, which we call rhythm. He gives them the seasons, each season different, yet every year the same, so that spring always felt as a novelty and yet always the recurrence of an immemorial theme. He gives them his church with a spiritual year. They change from a fast to a feast, but it is the same feast as before. Men will not only be contented, but transported by the mixed novelty and familiarity of snowdrops this January, sunrise this morning, and plum pudding this Christmas, which I think is so beautiful because it does point to how, even when we have this kind of issue with the commercialism, it is speaking to the fact that people really want to engage in some kind of rhythm of a year, that there is a sense of a place and a time for everything, and especially in an increasingly like secular society, and also in an increase of different faiths, that it is wonderful to get that sense of rhythm that we're all going through together, that it is one of the few things that still kind of unites us in some way, that we're all going through. And obviously we've got Southern Hemisphere maybe shaking their fists at us right now, but that for many of us that it is a communal experience. And I just think there's so much to be said for taking a more holistic view of the experience of the year. And one of the things that I love is the way that you integrated both the poetry of the Anglo-Saxons along with the religious and the agricultural and the different active seasons of the year, that they're all tied together, that they used poetry to understand the natural world around them, which informed them about the seasons, which also told them something liturgical, that all of these things were working together, which I think is something that, at least myself, I really kind of yearn for when I'm looking at the year ahead, that there is a sort of integrated sense in which we can look to literature as well as what's happening in churches and parishes, as well as what's happening in the nature around us. And it all informs this into this kind of great symphony that is the year.
I think it gives shape, doesn't it, to our own experience of time. And obviously everybody's individual pattern of work or life or whatever is individual and is very different. And yet there are these things that we can sort of share, we can recognize, not just with each other, with our own contemporaries, but with, people from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. That sense of, the snowdrops in January or something. When the snowdrops come, there are certain emotions that most people are going to feel at that moment in the year. They're passing through the cycles of, longer days and shorter days, or good weather, bad weather, all that kind of thing, which is going to affect your experiences, the things that you do, the way you feel at particular times of year. Those are very relatable kinds of experience, I think. And one of the things I was really hoping to do in the book was get a sense of how that felt for people in Anglo-Saxon England in ways that are similar to us, but also maybe some different ways as well. But just to have a sense of that diversity of experience and how human beings interact with the seasons in their lives, how those seasons give shape to our lives, give meaning to what we are doing as creatures just living through time.
Absolutely. And I love how you begin with winter and this idea of there is a line from one of the poems of fettered with frost, that winter has this enclosed feeling, this kind of bound feeling, as well as just being darker and colder and more uncomfortable. But there is this almost like chained feeling that then you point out becomes this sort of flood, literally often in spring, but that there is a more effusive and often one of the things I really loved in the book was where you pointed out that I think we often associate spring with like snowdrops and lambs.
Yeah.
And you were pointing out, now this is the month of mud. This is the month of floods and wind and kind of noise. That it was actually in some ways quite a turbulent time because it takes a lot of energy to move from the fetters of frost into the abundance of the summertime. And so I was thinking of spring as this both, more optimistic time, but also this time where there's a lot of kind of big emotions in some way.
Yeah, that's one of the things I find really interesting. I mean, I think the pattern of the Anglo-Saxon year, there are some ways in which their ways of seeing the seasons are kind of effectively, we can recognize, they take winter very seriously and to kind of see it as a real threat and talk a lot about the threat of winter. And I mean, it's not quite the same for us because we live in we have central heating, so it's not quite the same. But their approach to spring is really very different, just as their approach to autumn is very different. It actually doesn't have much in common with the way we see spring. I mean, there are some elements of similarity, and like I was saying about the kind of hopefulness or that sense of, new growth, new life, all of that. But yeah, that sense that after the imprisonment of winter, everything kind of runs free again. The waters are sort of surging. There's like a giant thaw is how they tend to imagine it. And it's full of energy and hope and kind of movement in one sense, but also it's a little bit perilous, or there's a sort of ambivalence there. Which suggests that the kind of new life that comes in spring is full of potential, but it's not a sort of sentimental way of thinking, oh yeah, nice bunnies and chicks and things like that we often maybe associate with spring. It's new life is something with a huge amount of power. And then of course, when that gets tied into the Christian liturgical calendar, if you're thinking about Lent and Easter, and that as a time of also of kind of new life and of liberation and of power, of something, hugely powerful. The most powerful event in human history is Christ rising from the dead and breaking the imprisonment of his own tomb. And if that's imagined, as it often is in the Anglo-Saxon poems, as a kind of parallel to breaking the imprisonment of winter for the new life of spring, that's not sentimental at all. It's something absolutely earth-shattering and kind of monumental and kind of awe-inspiring, as much as it is just like, pleasant. So it's quite a complex and nuanced sense they have of spring, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved that. And you had a section in the book which was talking about specifically that, where you were highlighting like floods and even like the comparison with in Beowulf, where they move from the frozen to the thawing, which is this like gush of water and then blood, with the different battle with Grendel's mother, the monster's mother, that tying that in, like you said, with the religious aspect. And I hadn't even really thought about it before, but those Old Testament stories of both Noah and then also the Red Sea, that this combination of water and blood as a gushing forth again from the side of Jesus on the cross, that there is this both kind of slightly threatening, like you said, like a gush of blood coming out, but also water that's very generative. And then that beautiful Anglo-Saxon idea of the cross as a tree, and then after Easter as a tree that's in bloom, that it's life-giving, that it is full of life. That it's very... I'm always amazed at the ways that the Anglo-Saxon imagination was able to weave in all of these different things at the one time and build on Old Testament imagery and their own kind of historical folkloric story imagery and their own image of Christ and then the world around them, that all of these things can get layered together to produce these really kind of very moving images for me.
Yeah, I think Beowulf is a really good example of that, because I mean, like you say, I talk about that moment in the book where in Beowulf where Beowulf is killing Grendel's mother. He's slaying the monster. And it's paralleled by the poet to the liberation that comes with spring, to the moment where the fetters of frost melt and life kind of gushes forth like a flood of blood or something. And there are a number of moments in Beowulf where on the one hand it's a story about a hero killing monsters, and it's coming from the Germanic past, and it's coming from very much a kind of Anglo-Saxon sensibility in one sense, but at the same time the poet is really interested in the idea of the seasons as illustrating God's power over the world, which is so immensely more powerful than anything human beings can conceive, or even mighty heroes like Beowulf, seem really powerless compared to the power of God. So that idea of the seasons as something which we try and understand, and which we certainly do experience, but which actually we have no control over, is something that the poet of Beowulf seems to have been quite interested in. And I like that emphasis on the power of the seasons, on that sense that they shape our world, but we effectively have no control over them whatsoever. It's a nice reminder of kind of our place in the universe, I suppose, in this kind of order of creation, that we're just subject to the changes of the seasons, and we have to deal with that as best we can.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of apparent in the ways that you highlighted how carefully and how much effort went into not controlling the seasons, but even measuring them. That like there was such a kind of, even before the Anglo-Saxon period, of course, but like figuring out the date of Easter being this big kind of contentious and difficult task, and that we take it for granted now. We look at our phone, it tells us the date, it tells us the time, and like all of these things are very straightforward. Anyone can look up like the phase of the moon. Like it's kind of it. The information is less kind of needed in some ways. We don't need to know when especially most of us will not be engaged in agriculture or any of those things, that like it's less pressing on our day to day, and yet it's more available to us than ever. But that there's such a careful wish to understand how the seasons are moving and measuring them in different ways, and then also tying that in with the liturgical calendar, and seeing how, if you're imagining it from a medieval point of view, you're imagining the world as very embodied as a creation of God, that everything is within God's power, and so everything should make sense and be ordered and have this deeper meaning. And I really loved the section that you have on explaining why Christmas is at Christmas, but it's why the 25th of March is so important as the day of the Annunciation and of Good Friday.
Yeah, so this is a tradition that, I mean, the medieval calendar nerds spent a lot of time thinking about this, and trying to think about. They could identify what the historical date of the crucifixion was, independent of when Easter is celebrated, which, as you say, was a whole other controversy on its own. That if they could identify the actual date on which Christ died, what was the significance of that date? And so the way someone like Bede thinks about it is that date is tied to the date of the Annunciation, March the 25th, and also to the date of the spring equinox, and also to the date on which time itself was created, way back at the beginning of time. Because they absolutely think of time as something that came into the world through God's creation. Like everything else, God created the sun and the moon, and when he did that, he created time and the measurement of time. And so the way someone like Bede thinks about it is, well, you can work out particular dates for these things, because of course human reason can start to, God has given us the ability to reason these things out. So we should try and work out what the first date in time was, when time began, and then when Christ died and when the Annunciation was, and all those kinds of things. So it's not just like they're picking random dates in the year and like, that'll do to celebrate that. We'll celebrate the Annunciation on March 25th. That's as good as any other date. There's a meaning behind it, and they see it as revealing something about the meaning that God has kind of written into the universe, because he is the one who ultimately is the source of time itself, and of the cycles of time and nature, the cycles of the sun and the moon and the seasons. They're all created by God. And so from their point of view, there's something to be understood about that. It's something we ought to try and understand if we possibly can.
Yeah, and of course, the point of it being the same day is that he enters on the same day that he leaves, and so it is a circle, and so you have this kind of eternal but also closed quality to his life on earth. But and I think I remember you actually had in your blog, we were lucky enough. Again, it feels like such a shame. I don't think enough of a fuss was made about it. Was it 1 or 2 years ago when we actually had the Annunciation?
I think it was 2016, something like that.
That we had this date, which I'm sure in a medieval time would have been. It's actually
really exciting.
It would have been the biggest festival I can imagine. Just that it actually comes together on the calendar, and I think you were sort of pointing out that now it's just seen as like, then we'll need to move the celebration of the Annunciation to another day, or like. in some ways seen as an inconvenience. And you were actually, to call back to our discussion just earlier about the way that kind of some secular versions of the world have kind of limited our ways in which we express ourselves, that discussion of fixing Easter to a specific date to, I guess, make something easier. I'm not quite sure what. But that, yeah, it's inconvenient for people to have Easter on a different day every year. And that actually, if we're looking at it from a medieval point of view, there is a much deeper sense of integration, that this is something that actually gives us meaning and gives us, a deeper understanding of the world that we're in, not just an annoyance because it's a little bit inconvenient or that it doesn't fit with our usual yearly expectations.
Yeah, some sense that because the most important thing about Easter is when schools are off or something, you have to pick a particular date, and that makes it all more convenient. And the strange thing about that particular discussion was it seemed like quite a lot of figures in the church hierarchy were also totally fine with the idea of a fixed date for Easter. So if the church isn't defending the importance of these dates, it's kind of hard to see who will, really. And yeah, I mean, something like the transference of liturgical feasts, this is also something that affects, say, Epiphany, which is a third feast now in lots of places. You do lose those quite carefully planned sense of, it's 12 days of Christmas. You have Christmas, then 12 days, and then Epiphany, which was the way it was for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now Epiphany can be on lots of different dates. And I mean, there are obviously things to be said for doing things in that way, and it does make things more convenient. But it does suggest that we don't have a full understanding of why these dates were formulated in the first place. It's not random. It was all planned with very careful consideration and with a purpose, and with some meaning behind it, and not just thinking about what's most convenient or kind of what fits in with the secular patterns of life, but suggesting there's something about time itself, which from a Christian point of view is sacred because it's a creation of God. And so to live through time is to kind of contact or to be in touch with that sort of sacredness. And so there's a value in trying to preserve it and at least understand why it was done in the first place.
And I also wonder, does it also feed into the kind of conception of medieval religiosity as arbitrary and superstitious and, as many people would say now, nonsensical? That, I don't think people appreciate the real kind of scientific and deliberate and educated approaches they had to all aspects of the year, that it wasn't as much as these are deciding on when liturgical things should happen, that they were also informed by cycles of the moon, that they were informed by equinoxes and by the length of the day and how much work it would have taken to work out all of these things, and drawing from, sources from the Middle East to tell them when Passover was supposed to be and why that's different for Christians, and then drawing on all of these kind of strands of information that, when you think of it from a medieval point of view, would have been quite difficult to gather all of that information together. And yet it was so important to them that this was actually an exercise in knowledge, in reason, in kind of scientific thinking, even when it's applied to something like a liturgical calendar. Yeah, absolutely. It is scientific thinking. And it takes a huge amount of thought, a lot of argument, a lot of debate and discussion. And I think we often have quite sort of simplistic and sort of stereotyped ideas of why church festivals often coincide with the solstice or the equinox or whatever. The story you usually get is, well, it was just, they stole it from the pagans, and that would make people think, oh yeah, we'll stick Christmas on the winter solstice, and that will sort of trick people into celebrating Christmas because they won't notice that it's changed or something. And it's much, much more complicated than that. And I mean, especially with the date of Easter, people have all these kind of rather fanciful ideas about, it was stolen from the pagan spring equinox festival, whatever. But the reason that Easter's tied to the spring equinox doesn't have anything to do with pagans. It's to do with the date of Passover, like you're saying, and that really complex relationship in the early church between its kind of Jewish heritage and the understanding of the Jewish calendar, and how that feeds into a Christian version of that, or a Christian adaptation of that, which is also taking in influences from other parts of the world, from Roman calendars and so on. It's a very complex story. And I think we just massively underestimate how much thought went into these kinds of decisions and how carefully they were made. It wasn't sort of a knee-jerk, just an attempt to kind of claim power from the pagans or something. Much, much more complicated than that. Yeah, there's a real sense that people want to almost read it as a a smash and grab kind of
Yeah.
attitude, which it's not that it's not at all that there's no value in seeing where pagan elements were tied or celebrated in different ways. But it is so overly simplistic to suggest, like you said, that it was just a case of saying, well, we'll take that now and we'll call it Christian festival instead. That there was something much more mature going on, which is to say and also I think it's even that thing that Tolkien talks about, which is the way that Christ kind of came to people over time, and that, from a medieval point of view, it was more about reordering things back towards Christ now that revelation had been given to them, rather than saying, oh, well, we just want to keep our party, so we'll just call it whatever you want. There's a sense in which it kind of denies the genuine religiosity of the people of the time, that it wasn't just, oh, we don't care what you call it, we just want to have our get together, that there was much more going on in terms of how they were understanding the world, and how this gave people a real sense of meaning and purpose in the space that they're in.
Yeah, I think we so often, the narrative is that it's about power. It's about the church trying to exert its power or something like that. And actually, it's much more complex than that, because it's not just a question of, the church makes a decision and then everyone else kind of falls in line. You've got a situation in which new forms of Christianity are embedding themselves in lots of different cultures, and they do that in all kinds of different ways. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about Anglo-Saxon England, where you get a certain version of the Christian calendar, which is drawing ultimately on, so through Roman influence, it's drawing on Jewish influence, and there's also a kind of Irish influence, and there's whatever is existing in pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon culture to kind of take into to the equation. There's this sense of kind of making something new out of all of these different elements, which becomes a particular expression of the Christian calendar that works within a particular place, a particular climate, particular agricultural cycles, which are very much kind of localized as well. It's not a kind of monolithic picture of like, well, this is Christianity, this is what medieval Christianity was like, it's one thing. Actually, it's quite a diverse picture, and different versions of the Christian calendar emerge in different parts of the Christian world, because these cultures are producing or are kind of coming up with calendars that make sense for them, that work for them, that produce meaning for the whole society, and not just sort of a bunch of clerics kind of saying, okay, no, we do this feast now, and whatever you call it, we're going to have it on this day. It's much more kind of a process of negotiation, I think, and sort of something that's meant to kind of work for the society as a whole.
Yeah, and that there is a sense in which it can be both universal and specific, like you're saying, that, all of the church is going through, let's say Easter, I like we're talking about our Orthodox brothers and sisters, and there is changes in that, but that in general, there is a sense of like Christmas is happening for everyone, or this is happening. And yet within that, you can have personal expressions of faith. You can have like localized traditions. You can have, things in Ireland that are specifically Irish. You can have things in England that are specifically English, and across Europe and anywhere really, that, it can express itself in different ways, and so that it speaks to a particular community, and yet also speaks broadly to something that is happening across large parts of space and time, that these are all actually uniting in some way. And I think that's really something beautiful, and that it is really kind of fascinating to see all of the different small traditions. Like I loved you had a reference to locking up the Alleluia, that they used to, that there were some communities that did like a burial rite for the Alleluia at the start of Lent. That's such a fun, interesting idea. And that, like, whereas in Ireland, where this episode will come out at the start of February, we have a slightly different conception. Like our springtime begins on February 1st, which I think is kind of unusual for some people, that like we are in spring, because the Irish calendar kind of preempts the season. It doesn't begin when it's in full swing. It's kind of more like it starts at the very beginning, and then you kind of get the climax in the middle, and then so it sort of does a peak and a trough, which is informative in its own way. And a bit like you have a great section in the book all about the different names of the months, and I always think it's so funny in Irish. There's no getting away from it. September is called middle of autumn. October is called end of autumn. It's man for and dera for, and you can't change that. But also that, like we were saying, that there's this great thing of medieval conception that is very uplifting because it's integrated. And yes, we have left behind some of that scientific understanding because we have developed. I've mentioned C.S. Lewis already. He talks wonderfully about how we did have to let go of the kind of earth-centric view of the heavens, but that there was still something worthwhile in that way of understanding the heavens, and that there's something at the very least on a human and emotional level that is actually kind of beautiful about looking up to the heavens as something that you're at the center of, rather than kind of floating in an endless space. I love that quote he has about the motions of the universe are to be conceived not as those of a machine or even an army, but rather as a dance, a festival, a symphony, a ritual, a carnival, or all of these things in one. They are the unimpeded movement of the most perfect impulse towards the most perfect object. And like that really ties in with seeing the cosmos itself as a feast day or as a festival, that like this is how important it is to our experience of the world to engage with these feasts and festivals, and on the flip side, fasting and penance, and the to have both as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's lovely. And I think one of the things that I really like about some of the ways Anglo-Saxon poems talk about time is they kind of imagine the year as on this journey itself. I mean, the reason I've used the word journey in the title of the book is because they talk about the journey of the year, that the months are on a journey. They sweep into the human world, and then they sweep out again, or they glide in and they glide out, or whatever. And so it's like everything is in motion, and yet it's not a random motion. It's something very orderly. One thing follows another in its proper progression, and it is like a dance or a kind of a procession or something. And so the way they're thinking about, for instance, the movement of the planets and the movement of time, all of these things kind of echo each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved how you described you reference a lot of different texts and poems, but there is two that really stick out, the Menologium and Maxims too. But you call the Menologium a calendar in verse and time turned into poetry, which is such a lovely way of describing those poems, but also describing an approach to the year, that it's a beautiful work which takes the whole year and weaves in all of the different kind of seasons and solstices and equinoxes and all of those things. But it isn't just a list of dates or a list of calculations. It is actually a poem that brings you through the essence of each of those seasons and festivals and the ways that they understood it. I just think it's so beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful too. And Anglo-Saxonists don't value this poem at all. This poem was in some ways like the germ of the whole book, because I think it is absolutely beautiful to imagine the passage of time in poetry in that way. But it's a poem which has been absolutely kind of not regarded at all by specialists, because they see it as just like, oh, it's just a list of dates, or a very kind of conventional poem, or it's just echoing lots of cliches from other poems. But what it actually offers as a picture of the year, as a kind of a holistic cycle, is something which gives us a really interesting insight into how people were thinking about time and experiencing time, and the kinds of language that they were using for it. So I think it's kind of really underrated, and a lovely. It offers a lovely way of thinking about the cycle of the year.
Yeah, and I think the other one that I really loved, and I know we're maybe at the wrong time of year, you have to come the whole way around again, but I love the way you talk about the O antiphons, and the way that the Anglo-Saxons wrote these kind of extended poems about them. And so as you say in the book, the way that most people know the great Advent O antiphons is from O Come Emmanuel. So if you just take that hymn and break it down, those are the O antiphons, but they appear in different ways in the church. But that the Anglo-Saxons took those basic kind of titles of Jesus that are given in that hymn, Key of David, Day Spring, Emmanuel, all of those ones, and then extended it and built on that Old Testament tradition, and also brought in all of their own poetic background to create these really beautiful liturgical poems that are specifically Anglo-Saxon and also specifically liturgical. And that they were just so sophisticated in the way that they did that.
Yeah, it's absolutely an example of these different traditions kind of coming together and producing something really beautiful as the result of a mixture and a melding and one tradition taking inspiration from another. It's a kind of mutual flourishing kind of thing, because on the one hand they're absolutely kind of quoting scripture and they're turning passages from the Old Testament into Old English poetry, which is not an easy thing to do, but a very interesting thing to do. But at the same time, they're doing things like, instead of O Oriens, the day star, like what is it in the day spring, isn't it, in the Come Emmanuel? They're using the name Earendel, which is a name for the dawn or for the morning star or something, which probably comes ultimately from Anglo-Saxon paganism. And it produces this absolutely beautiful poem, which is drawing on these really deep roots of the Anglo-Saxon understanding of the sun or the stars or whatever, is kind of whatever is the first light of dawn, effectively, is what it means, but also drawing on the liturgical antiphon. So it produces this absolutely extraordinary poem. And it was one of the poems that particularly influenced Tolkien, as you probably know, because Earendel is a word that sort of gave him almost like a mystical experience when he read that poem as a young man, and he borrowed the name and he took it into his own mythology as a star name and a really important character. And it has this extraordinary power, that poem. And I think that power comes from the fact that it's drawing on all these deep wells of inspiration and producing something new out of all of those disparate materials.
Yeah, I think that's so spot on, that it's when we pull together all of these different strands that we really get something that is speaks to the heart of people, and that can inspire someone like Tolkien so many hundred years later, that not only is it a great artistic achievement in its own right, but then goes on and inspires and continues to speak to people in different ways. That it's just so exciting to see that. And I don't know if there are any parts of any of those poems, maybe the Menologium or the Maxims, if that you wanted to make sure people noticed or that you particularly loved.
I think the one I always come back to is actually the one that gave me the title for the book, which is a line from The Wanderer, the Old English elegy, The Wanderer. And it's about this phrase, winters in the world, which is just a poetic convention, a way of saying years. It's about talking about the years that a person has lived. You've lived 30 winters in the world or whatever. It's a nice kind of way of talking about that. But the line in The Wanderer is that a man cannot become wise before he has had his share of winters in the world. And the sense there is obviously that winter is not just a way of thinking about time, but also seasons of suffering in our lives, seasons of deprivation, winter in its more kind of negative sense of something that you have to endure in order to get through and get to the spring. And the poem suggesting everybody has those seasons in their lives. We all have a share of winters in the world that we all have to live through. That's individual to us, just like our tally of years in our age is individual to us. But through that, you become wise. So it's not suffering without purpose. It's a kind of experience that can teach you. If you live through these many, many seasons, some of them will be good, some of them will be less good. But ultimately, there's a kind of wisdom to be found through that experience of living through time, and through its different seasons and these different experiences. Somehow wisdom will be found through all of that. I think that's probably my favorite. That's one of my favorite lines in Old English poetry generally, I think so.
That's brilliant. I really loved, it's funny how one of the reasons I love Anglo-Saxon literature and history is that actually going back to the etymology really, for me anyway, just gives you such a fresh way of understanding the connections between the world and how we can understand things. I really loved how actually in the Rogation Tide section that we mentioned earlier, you were talking about just the word hal, because you said on these sort of penitential processions, you point out that as penance purifies the soul, the processions cleanse and make holy the physical world. They are healing and hallowing, and they promote community wholeness. Three ideas which go back to the same Old English root hal, meaning healthy, sound, whole. Etymologically speaking, to heal, to hallow are both to make whole. And so that these Rogation days seek physical and spiritual health for the individual, the community, and the natural world, and that they're all connected in one harmonious whole, that there is this actual way that all of these things are working together in this one small three-letter word, hal, that tells us that blessing and physical health and spiritual health and the health of the landscape are all about trying to become this whole thing, this integrated, this complete, this, unfallen thing in some ways, that we're striving for a sense of wholeness in all of it. That to see the year as a whole is to, like you said, with these winters in the world, to see the sufferings as part of it coming in and out, but that then there are also seasons of summer and then seasons of harvest, which I think you had a great point about how, like you said, that they don't really have this, again, speaking of very commercialized things, that one of the episodes we did last year was on the sort of conception of autumn as this now sort of like very packaged thing that people sort of sell, which was not in the Anglo-Saxon concept at all. But that when you have your harvest, you're reaping your rewards. And so that there's lessons to be learned from Our Lady and her assumption into heaven and the reaping of rewards, that we can have all of these different seasons in the year that have their place. And suffering is part of those. The winters in the world are certainly part of those. In fact, they, as you pointed out, they compose of a large, not the greatest of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and yet there is space for more light as well. And that, like the O antiphons that we were mentioning, you point out, are sung at the darkest time of the year and speak to the hope of the light to come, that we can stand at midwinter and say, come Emmanuel, come light, come hope, come peace, that these are things that we can, with the seasons, expect that there will be a season of light to come after darkness.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And there's this sense that these kinds of experiences can also correspond to seasons in our own lives. So, we will have winters, or times in our lives that feel like winter, but also times that feel like spring and summer and harvest, and one of the poems I talk about is it's called the Rhyming Poem, and it kind of maps the seasons onto an individual's life. He talks about his youth as like a time of springtime and beginning and hope and energy and all of that. And then he moves into a summer and a harvest, a time of kind of settled prosperity and success and, feeling kind of like he's fixed and secure in the world. But then he declines into a kind of autumn and a winter as well. So all of these things, they correlate to our experiences in lots of different ways, not actually just literally in terms of living through the cycle of the year, but also in our own understanding of seasons of, deprivation or plenty, or times of hardship, but also times of success and celebration, whatever it might be. I think they often think about these times. They very, very much are parts of human experience, to have these seasons, but they pass, they move on to something else. There's always something else to come.
That's wonderful. And so, I think that's why, I would recommend to all of my listeners to get the book. I think it's wonderful. I'll have it linked in the description. I think it's just, and it's a really accessible book, I think, as well, for people. As much as I enjoyed it from coming from a background of knowing a bit more about Anglo-Saxon, I felt like it was really accessible for anyone who is just coming to it fresh, that it is something that will speak to a whole host of different people. I feel like, because as I mentioned, I saw it on a whole bunch of lists of like people recommending it over Christmas, that like this was something that, I think is speaking to our need for acknowledging and entering into the seasonality of our lives and also of the year. And that, especially as we, I think, struggle to connect to the world in some ways, that like we either we live in cities, or that we're concerned about the changes in the climate, or the way that we're treating the world, that there are all these kinds of tense feelings about the world around us, and that re-entering the seasons is some way to reclaim our relationship both with creation, and then, from a Christian point of view, reclaim that relationship with our Creator as well, that these are all part of the great scheme of creation, that medieval idea of a very embodied and integrated creation that God is working through, that is planned and loved into being and understood and should be cherished by us.
Yeah, I think there's very much this sense of, this is something that we can rediscover. It's all there, it's all out there, and accessing some understanding of what happens through the cycle of the seasons is as simple in a way of just looking out the window or whatever, just paying attention. And I think that's what I really like about the Old English poems, is they pay attention, they notice things, they're thoughtful and they're attentive to the natural world and to how it relates to lots of different forms of human experience. And I think we can learn to pay attention as well. It's the simplest thing to ask. And there are so many claims on our attention, so many things which attempt to distract us, but being able to kind of have a sort of mindful focus on the seasons can be really fruitful, I think.
And in some ways, maybe they had such insight because perhaps they had less distractions. The natural world was much more immediate to them. There weren't any barriers between them in the same way. But yeah, I think that's wonderful. So, like I said, I will certainly be linking the book down below. I also want to give a shout out. You also released another book last year, Conquered: The Last Children of Anglo-Saxon England, which I believe is a more strictly historical book. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's about the generation of English children who lived through the Norman conquest and then kind of grew up in its aftermath. So, looking at what happened to them and how their stories were remembered.
In some ways, it kind of, the end of your book leaves off at the end, like at the Norman conquest. So it's not a sequel, but you can see it that way. So yeah, I'll definitely link that as well. And so I think I just have one last question to ask you, which is, what are you enjoying at the moment?
Well, this does actually kind of relate to, I don't want to suggest that I'm just obsessed with the seasons, but this does relate. What I've been mostly doing over Christmas was rereading The Lord of the Rings, which I haven't reread for a few years. And I really was very struck by just how important the seasons are in the early, especially the early part. Tolkien was clearly very careful about making it run from the autumnal equinox in September up to March 25th, which is the date of the destruction of the ring. We were talking about how important that date is in medieval culture, and he clearly thought a lot about that. So I've been sort of reading the book and really enjoying that aspect of it for the first time, really.
I'm so glad you said that. Listeners know that I am always talking about, especially whenever September comes around, it's like a strong temptation to just open the Fellowship of the Ring back again. And, like you said, even the fact that I think they leave Rivendell on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
They don't call it Christmas Day, but he is such care of when things are happening. It is, again, he's very integrated in the way he's like carefully plotting everything out. Everything has a meaning, everything has a greater understanding. In a similar way, I think the thing I was going to recommend is I just finished a collection of W.H. Auden's longer poems, which included his poem For the Time Being, which is his Christmas oratorio, which again has a wonderful section about the time after Christmas and like how we put away our better expectations of ourselves and see how we failed and see how we didn't really live up to our hopes and how we were impatient with our relatives and all of those things. But just, I found it really beautiful. I think we mentioned the Advent section in the episode just at Christmas, but I was reading the whole poem again, and then he has another one for New Year's as well. So I was like, okay, it's the time of year, I better read it. And so I would recommend those. And other than that, I guess, is there anything you want to shout out other than the books? Obviously, if any of our listeners are on Twitter, they should follow you, Clerk of Oxford. Is there anything else you want to shout out?
No, I think that's it. Just, come find me on Twitter.
Great. And thanks very much for listening. I'm delighted to be back for the year, and we'll look forward to the next episode soon. Goodbye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.